is the second day of our Hindsight 2020 virtual festival, and tonight's section is titled Computation as Material. So we have a great lineup tonight with 13 student presenters across the MFA and BFA programs. And we also have our guest moderators, Dr. Pinar Yoldas, who will be joining for the first hour's Q&A, and Mimi Onuoha, who will be joining for the second. So just a quick rundown. The first part of the live stream will be from 6 to around 7:15, followed by a Q&A. Then we'll have a short 5-minute break, and we'll then hop back on to Zoom. And the second part of the live stream will be from 7:15 to 8:20, followed by our second Q&A with Mimi. So feel free to cheer your people on in the chat if you're joining us with Zoom. But otherwise, I'd like to remind everyone to please put themselves on mute and have their video feed turn off while we do this. So 6:04. Wait another 20 seconds or so, and then we'll get things started. All right, 6:05, everyone. So I guess let's be prompt and start day 2 of our live stream. So to kick today off, we have Jeffrey, who is a MFA student. Jeffrey, feel free to take it away.
Hi, I'm Jeffrey Geringer, and I'm here to present some of the world's first AI sculpture. Can you tell what this is? Put your guesses in the chat. No. All right, time's up. It is neither an elephant, a dragon, a T-Rex, a skeleton. Oh, man. This object is a combination of the American flag and an AR-15 assault rifle. This presentation will explain how it came into existence. Welcome to Object Americana. My thesis project is called Object Americana. It consists of a dance, a choreography of creation that I have scripted between myself and the AI agents I have partnered with. The results of that choreography are the objects you see here. Each of these objects is a combination of two things, a hybrid combined object sculpture created using AI with the theme of American iconography. Why AI? I came into this program with the firm belief in the idea that AI agents can be a creative force in their own right. For my thesis, I wanted to make a project that demonstrated this. That belief is rooted in what I see as the AI's unique perceptive ability. The AI sees the world in a way that humans cannot, through the form of pure data and computer-encoded reality. Moreover, the development of artificial intelligence is one of the most profound forces in our society right now, and I believe it has historic implications. I've grown tired of projects that see AI like a soulless threat to freedom. To me, the powers that use it for these measures are the real threat. I see it as more like a trained dog. Trained to dangerous ends, it is undeniably a grotesque, vicious creature, fulfilling its master's twisted desires. Trained to harmless ends, it can be a fun and loyal companion. Indeed, I believe we are witnessing the very early stages of a neonatal species in the AIs we are creating, and I try to treat them as such. So why sculpture? Well, I'm a sculptor. I've always expressed myself in 3D space. My undergraduate studies were first in architecture, then in sculpture. I found sculpture to be far more intimate and human, both in scale and scope. I believe there's a quality about sculpture that means it hasn't yet been fully digitized. Even VR cannot yet reproduce the physicality of moving one's body around to view a sculpture. Object Americana embraces this fact while turning it on its head. The project is an attempt to create a new genre of sculpture that is fundamentally digital, while maintaining its inherent physicality through the use of 3D printing. I mentioned that all the objects in the project are combined forms of two other objects. You might be curious, why combination? The answer is twofold. First, because this project is about AI creativity, And I believe that combining things, synthesizing new things out of disparate parts, is one of the most creative things you can do. The second reason is a bit more complicated. To me, combining objects like this is a creative act that has semiotic implications. The objects to be combined all have very strong cultural significance, and so combining them gives form to a new hybrid meanings and concepts that don't previously exist. I hope these objects will invoke contemplation of these new meanings through their form. The subject matter of my thesis, aside from all that I just mentioned, is the United States of America as an icon and concept. You may ask, why Americana? We live in utterly bizarre political and economic realities, and they are shifting under our feet every day. I am turning 30 years old at the end of this month, and all my life I have had the distinct sensation of making my way in the ruins of a former society. I am from the state of Michigan in the Midwest, and anyone from the region will tell you that its glory days were a generation and a half ago. I've grown up with a sense of tragedy, even beyond the many other tragedies that have befallen the millennial generation. When it came time to choose what to turn my sights on as an artist, the choice was clear: the slow death of an empire rotting from the inside out. I don't mourn that empire. Rather, I am trying to observe it, comment on it, perhaps make sense of it, perhaps make confusion of it. Finally, now I've established just what we're doing here, let's talk about how. Here's an overview of the process. The first step is picking the objects. To do this, I developed a questionnaire and sent it out over the email list, as well as spread it among friends. It was targeted at immigrants to the United States, but I did accept answers from anyone. They were asked a series of questions about their experience with the country and about what objects they associate with it from the three distinct phases of their lives: past or childhood, present, and future. In this way, I was able to create hybrid objects representing these three distinct mental epochs in American history. After picking the objects and making data sets, the next major step is to train the AI. For this project, I have used a 3D point cloud GAN. A GAN, generative adversarial network, is a type of very interesting generative AI. I'm sure we'll hear more about GANs throughout the night. To create hybrid objects with the AI, I gave it a single data set that contained both objects in equal measure. This is a trick I'm trying to pull over on the AI, and it only works for a short period of time. Toward the beginning of the training process, it cannot tell the difference between the two things and happily generates these hybrid objects. Later on, it catches wise and sees through my trick. It starts generating either one object or the other, and this part of the dance is over. The next major step is for me to sift through the hybrid objects created by the AI and pick one to turn into a final piece. After that, I sit here on my computer and spend about 6 to 12 hours finishing the object manually. I do this by drawing triangle mesh faces between the points generated by the AI using a simple surface meshing algorithm as a guide. After a great deal of coffee, the object is complete. Phew. Let's look at the objects. All right, first object. This represents the past, idyllic childhood views of America. It is a combination of the Statue of Liberty and the McDonald's M logo. Here's the printed version. I think it looks kind of like an angel. This object represents the present. It combines President Donald Trump's head with a suburban McMansion house. I think this has quite a lot of resonance since the man was elected primarily with support from the suburbs. The suburbs themselves being a uniquely American path to political decay and destruction. This object is a device for the future. And the questionnaire results, it was clear that people think the future of America is class warfare, with a heavy dose of electric vehicles. This object is a combination of a guillotine and an electric motorcycle. Finally, I cannot ignore an overwhelming through line of the data. For all three mental epochs of American history, people responded that the flag is a constant object. They say the same thing about guns. The ultimate totalizing form of Object Americana is a combined flag assault rifle. Enjoy. Special thanks to my incredible partner, Steph, and of course, many thanks to my studio advisors, Colleen Macklin, Anejka Sebek, Ayo Okunsende, and of course, Harpreet Serene. Cheers and thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Next up, we've got Ray, who is an MFA student. Ray, take it away.
Hi, I believe I just have a video to show. Sorry, I guess I should. My project is about human-machine. My project is about human-machine communication in the context of how they're arranged in space and the gestures that machines have. So this project is my thesis at Parsons School of Design. So my project is about human-machine communication in the context of how they're arranged in space and the gestures that machines have. My project is about human-machine communication in the context of how they're arranged in space and the gestures that machines have. So this project is my thesis at Parsons School of Design. So first, I want everybody to think about the Knights of the Round Table. The reason that they're a round table is that everybody has equal access and equal importance in the space. But what you notice is actually okay, guys, I'm getting a lot of different messages from a lot of different people, so I'm going to try to sort this out. I think what the easiest thing for me to do is just give the presentation right now, given that of the technical difficulties with the videos somehow. So I'm just going to give it right now. So give me 1 second. I'm just going to bring it up right here. Okay. Okay, here we go. My project is about human-machine communication in the context of how they're arranged in space and the gestures that machines have. Yeah, let me just give it then. It looks like the video is not showing. So, my thesis at Parsons School of Design. You guys can all hear me? Fine? Yeah? Good? I can just go? Okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay, sounds good. Okay. All right, so I'm going to give a slightly shortened version of what I gave on the video, but here we go. So my project, actually, you already heard the first part. I don't have to repeat the first part again. So I'm looking at human-machine communication in the context of space and how space shapes that type of interaction. This is my Parsons work. So Knights of the Round Table, as I was saying in the video. So the interesting thing with the Knights of the Round Table is that you think it's everybody's equalitarian. They're all, you know, in a similar standing and with respect to the space that they occupy. But what you notice is that there's always some person who's sitting opposite the door, and there's always a door, right? So that person, guess who it is? It's King Arthur. So what that means is even when you try to make the space equalitarian, there's some hierarchy, there's some implicit influence. And these types of implicit influence have been found. For example, we think ads differently when you sit in different seating arrangements, for example. In my own work, though, it's about machine gestures and how the gestures operate. So the question is, how do the gestures operate in space? So, for example, this is work from Wendy Juice Labs, where they have, you know, kind of futuristic mobile furniture that actually does different things that are unexpected to the human. So they utilize the space to give forth that gesture. So this is important for the design for the future, because future there will be situations where we have mobile furniture and furniture that, you know, are spaces that can remap themselves, for example. And even right now in Zoom, you notice that there's actually different hierarchical things going on. There's like people in the upper left, lower right, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And so the way that we imagine space is really important. So the framework that I have come up with this is the idea that robot interact with humans both overtly and interacts with the environment, which then shapes human behavior implicitly. So both of those things are crucial in understanding how the robotic agent with the environment as a whole is interpreted by us. So I made 3 studies based on this. So the first study is actually just to look at how people actually gaze in visual scenes where we put the chairs in different, in this case, I'm looking at chair furniture, to put the chairs in different arrangements. And so I put people under eye tracker. So this is what you see. So you fixate and then you look at a scene like this, right? And then you fixate again, and then you look at a different scene. And in those scenes, they're arranged differently and they're controlled for things like lighting and like windows and things like that. So this is the typical situation. So what you can see is actually that they're looking at the table a lot and they're kind of gazing away, et cetera, et cetera. So what I find from this result is very interesting is that when you put the chairs, arranged towards the same direction, looking at like a wall in the back, what people is they start looking at the screen that's there. And then in the same scene with the chairs arranged differently, when they're in a circle, people tend to look at the table. And not only that, when you talk to people afterwards, they tell you people like, oh, in the table, it looks like they're having some sort of chat discussion, is this a room for that? And then the other one, people are going like, oh, this is like a room for movies, et cetera, et cetera. So in conclusion, this study shows us that the arrangement of these chair robots I have in the space actually influences the way people view the space. The second study is actually done in collaboration with folks at Cornell Tech. So in this study, it's about the gesture side. So not the spatial side, it's more the gesture side. So in this case, for example, we show people video. So we show people different videos of chair gestures. So in this case, this is one chair gesture. You have the chair basically kind of like, pushing forth in front of the woman, and that's basically telling the girl to move, let's get going, right? So this is coded correctly in this case because that person actually interprets it the way that we thought it would be. But if you look at some other user, they could actually interpret this incorrectly. For example, this person is thinking that the chair is actually following the woman. And so what you can do is basically show people a bunch of different types of movies of chair interactions, right? So for example, here's a chairs where they look at each other, and the idea is to kind of force folks to kind of work together. And then there's another one where they kind of put themselves in one direction to kind of get people to focus onto this thing in the back, basically. Right. So this is like telling them, oh, let's focus, guys. Let's see what's back there. Okay. And then there's also one sort of one-sided interactions where, for example, in this case, the chair is literally just following that person around the room. So when you look at the different gestures, you can actually basically use this to design your gesture sets, right? To understand, oh, okay, so like this gesture actually influences the way people think that the chairs are being expressive versus the way that they're having relationships with each other, et cetera, et cetera. So those are 4 questions that we ask them: how responsive they are, how expressive the chairs are, et cetera. And what you can see in the tracking one is actually super responsive, but it doesn't affect the person as much. So in conclusion, we can actually use different videos to prototype interactions with possible future type chairs. So finally, just as the final part, I actually brought these 2 things together into this virtual environment, because the idea is that in the virtual environment, you can actually get the chairs to do all kinds of interesting, crazy things, but you can also put them in the space that you want, and you have the control of being able to map out the space the way you want it. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. So I actually built a scene where you can have all these crazy chairs going around, you can choreograph how the interactions go. And then there's both the gestural part and the way that I arrange them in the space. So basically in this experiment, I put people into 2 different types of spaces. So one is where they are lying, and one is where the chairs are in a circle. And so what I do is basically look at the particular gesture in which the chairs start looking at you. So we can see here is basically the chairs start looking at you. If you follow around in the room, you actually, the chairs will all follow you. It's kind of slightly creepy. So what happens is basically in this scene, people actually are stunned differently, or they interpret that gesture differently based on which context is in, whether the chairs actually align or whether they're in a circle. And it turns out that when they're in a line, they're much more in shock. They go like, oh my goodness, is this really what's going on? So what that means is actually the effect of that gesture on you actually depends on the way that the chairs are arranged. So I basically came up with a way to test a part of the idea that both the spatial and the gestural component can interact with each other to influence how we interpret things. So I guess one obvious questions is what about real digital physical chairs, how they compare with digital chairs that I showed you? And also, what's the implication for design in the future? Like, are the future designs in such a way that chairs can actually be mobile in different ways? They have IoT, which communicate it in interesting ways. So thanks to everybody involved, Jess, Danielle, Wendy, who helps me a lot at Cornell Tech and is basically what her lab also works on in chair robots. Judy Hall for the psychology mentorship, etc. So thanks everybody and congratulations.
Thanks so much, Ray, and thanks definitely so much for doing this on the fly. That was an amazing presentation. Next up, we've got Karen, who's also an MFA student, and her presentation is titled Machinic Interpolations, a GAN Pipeline for Integrating Lateral Thinking in Computational Tools of Architecture.
Hi, my name is Karen Asmar, and today I'll be introducing my thesis project titled Machinic Interpolations. To help you Hi, my name is Karen Asmar, and today I'll be introducing my thesis project titled Machinic Interpolations. To help you understand. Hi, my name is Karen Asmar, and today I'll be introducing my thesis project titled Machinic Interpolations. Hi, my name is Karen Asmar, and today I'll be introducing my thesis project titled Machinic Interpolations. To help you understand a bit the context of this project, I will introduce first who I am. I'm initially an architect, and today I call myself a design technologist, and specifically a spatial design technologist. So what I mean by that is that for the past 2 years, I have been experimenting with new ways of merging digital space with the physical space by finding new methods of interaction in space, whether with each other, with information in space, or with the space itself. While working at this intersection, I decided for my thesis project to go back a bit and reflect on the ways we actually design the spaces where these experiences happen. So why is this important? As an architect, I always took for granted the tools that existed to design. I never really questioned how these tools came to be, how they function, or what forms of interaction do they allow me to do or not allow me to do while I'm designing. For me, these tools were just there. And if I wanted to design something, I could work within this virtual space that these tools have laid out for me and just start designing. But these spaces are not really as neutral as you might think. Within these environments, we're constrained to work with specific functions and methods in mind. We're able to work with points, lines, curves, and surfaces and manipulate those to generate designs. We also have certain functions that we could use, like extrude, loft, copy, etc., to draw something in 3D. And the results we produce will always be constrained to the options possible to achieve using these methods. The way these tools are designed is that we're really trying to take what we used to do with a pen and a paper on architectural drawings and replicate this process using machines. We're working with these images that fall on screens and treating them the same way that we used to treat architectural drawings. But these two environments do not function the same way. In those drawings, there were always the errors of a pencil or the inspiration from a not completely erased line that affected the designs and inspired new ways of thinking. And this is what I'm referring to as lateral thinking, thinking that we usually get while drawing or sketching. Apart from in drawings or sketching, architects also experimented with materials as a lateral thinking strategy. For example, Frey Otto used soap to get inspirations for his designs. He embraced uncertainties and found answers and inspirations in accidents and errors in this process. But as soon as we moved to digital, all this experimentation seemed to fade away, and a focus on accuracy and precision started to emerge. So why are we limiting ourselves to thinking this way when these two separate tools clearly do not function the same way? How can we extrapolate the potential of the machines we draw on to address lateral thinking approaches in our processes? So to respond to this, for my thesis project, I proposed a methodology that resulted in this. When you look at these structures, the first thing that comes to mind is not really architecture. However, these structures are the result of a machine learning experiment using GANs to integrate lateral thinking in computational tools of architecture. So how did I reach this point? Initially, to find an answer to my questions, I started looking beyond the field of architecture, and I found this answer in artificial intelligence, and specifically in GANs. I was particularly inspired by Deep Dream, a project by a Google engineer wherein he asked, in an artificial neural network, what is the machine's reasoning? What happens between the image input layer that receives the image and the output layer where the solution emerges? By tapping onto the hidden layers of the machine, it became possible to see the world through the eyes of the machine. Another project I was fascinated by is an attempt to represent human faces using machines, and particularly I was inspired by how it is possible to mix between images to create new images with very similar attributes. The way this works is through GANs. GANs are a class of machine learning systems, and specifically deep neural networks that are commonly used for generative purposes. They are composed of two neural networks, a generator and a discriminator, that compete against each other in a feedback loop to improve their performance. The resulting GAN model is then able to generate images that share qualities with the initial dataset. But if GANs learn to replicate an initial dataset, how can they be used for lateral thinking? So I looked at another project called Pix2Pix. It is also an adversarial network. However, instead of one image, this model is trained on image pairs. It seems straightforward, wherein one person draws an outline of a cat and then gets an image of a cat. It's sort of human and machine collaboration, where humans start and machines finish. However, it was interesting to see how people started misusing this and experimenting with it in completely new ways. I was fascinated by the inaccuracies of a machine and the in-between states it created that leave so much for the human imagination. So I started testing this use of GANs in architecture. To test this, the first step was to collect a dataset to actually train it on. I chose a dataset of architectural plans of specifically housing projects, and I scraped around 5,000 images from different websites. I trained my GAN model, and specifically a SciGAN model, to generate a latent space. A latent space is an abstract multidimensional vector space where the generator model in the GAN architecture can take a point from the space and generate an image. We can also travel through the space, and as we move in it, we can interpolate between different generated images. So for my experiment, I took 4 points within the space and I interpolated between them. What it means to interpolate is to transition from point A to point B in X number of steps. In this case, I took 40. So I did this for all the 4 points I chose. And I'd stacked these images generated in Z space. After stacking them, I read their pixel values and created a 3D array of numbers that was then translated into 3D voxels. And by this, I was able to create a system that can go from 4 points in this latent space to a 3D voxelized structure. After setting this as my main pipeline, I then thought of different ways of sketching or experimenting in this space, similar to the experiment with soap, except here I'm working with digital material. So the initial experiment I did was based on treating all the images equally. But what happens if I want more of one plan and less of another? So I tested this and was able to generate a completely new structure. But this is not the only way of working within this space. Since I'm working in a vector space, I am able also to add between plans and generate a new vector. So I did that for every point and then interpolated between them and was able to generate a third structure. And finally, for my fourth approach, I combined the percentage approach with the mixing approach and generated a fourth model. So from 4 initial points, I was able to come up with completely 4 different models. But also, that's not the only way to interpolate between those points. In the initial test, I went from A to B to C to D. However, I could have went in any other order. In the previous examples, I was working with 4 initial points. However, in such a wide latent space, I could have worked with any different options. So I took different options and generated this gallery of other 3D structures, wherein each one can be further explored using the methods introduced. So, the use of GANs and its internal properties in this project presents us with a new set of interaction methods that normally lie outside the traditional boundaries of the architectural discipline. The architectural results of this methodology create a highly complex gallery of forms with distinctive aesthetic features that go beyond human capabilities. Although generated from architectural plans, these forms fall at the intersection between conceptual models and architectural structures that transcend the architecture we are familiar with today and could greatly inspire new designs. This particular shift in traditional thinking, if integrated into the tools of today, may enable us to incorporate lateral thinking into our current digital processes and pull our architectural tools out of the industrial era thinking. Hence, by reinforcing the uncertain and the unpredictable, designers can move away from established ways of thinking, and the course of the discipline can finally be readjusted with our digital futures. Thank you so much everyone for listening, and special thanks to Harpreet Sareen for being extremely patient and tolerating me for 2 whole years, to Loretta Wolozine for her constant feedback, and to Catherine Moriwaki and Jamie Keels for being amazing Thesis 1 advisors. Thank you.
Yes, Karen!
Thanks, Karen, so much. I love your work always, and I'm really excited to see what's next for this project. Next up is Noah.
Give me 1 second. Okay, can you see my presentation? I can't see the chat, so I'm going to assume yes. I'm Noah. My project is called Masked Contexts. So let's begin. So Masked Contexts is an exploration into the COCO dataset and dialogue with the photographers whose images were scraped by the dataset's authors without their knowledge or consent. And I'll return back to COCO in a second, but I think it's important to discuss where the project started to understand how I got to this point. This is a quote from artist Memo Atkin, who was a big inspiration for me in the early stages of this project. And it reads, "We can only understand the world through the lens of everything that we've seen or heard or read before. We are constantly trying to make sense of everything that we experience based on our past experiences. We see things not as they are, but as we are. One who has only ever seen thousands of images of the ocean will see the ocean everywhere they look." And AI and computer vision are the exact same way, right? They are literally called artificial neural networks because the process is copied from our own biology. This is a project by Memo Atkin that's kind of a manifestation of that quote, in which he fed a neural network very specific data sets, so in this case, just images of the ocean, so that when it sees that video on the on the left for the first time, it can only understand it through ocean. So the cloth becomes water, the wrinkles become waves. This is a quote from Kate Crawford and Trevor Paglin's Excavating AI essay, which looks into the politics of image data sets. And it's really this last sentence that I want to focus on, which reads, "The whole endeavor of collecting images, categorizing them, and labeling them is itself a form of politics, filled with questions about who gets to decide what images mean and what kinds of social and political work those representations perform." So why are image data sets important? Without going into too much detail, essentially algorithms are fed thousands of photos and told what's in them so that when presented with an image or a video that they've never seen before, in this case kangaroos, it can understand what is in that image. To reiterate, my project, Masked Contexts, is an exploration into the COCO dataset and a dialogue with the photographers whose images were scraped by the dataset's authors without their knowledge or consent. So what is COCO? COCO, which stands for Common Objects in Context, is a public online image database originally published by Microsoft. It contains approximately 330,000 images, all of which were scraped from Flickr without the photographer's knowledge or consent. And many of these images are intimate family photos uploaded by amateur photographers for personal use, as people tend to use Flickr. Datasets like COCO are often used to train computer vision programs that are used for things such as surveillance technology. And while the COCO dataset provides metadata for each image that contains information, no credit or reference is made to the original uploader, to the photographer. So what did I do? I managed to reverse engineer the dataset through custom scripts to provide additional metadata, including the Flickr username associated with each image. And I started reaching out to them, and this is a screenshot of one of the messages I sent. I informed them that their photos were part of the dataset and asked them to provide the original context of the photos, as well as their feelings regarding their images being used in a dataset like COCO. Unfortunately, Flickr suspends messaging after 20 messages are sent from a new account as a sort of anti-spam measure. So I had to make quite a few accounts throughout this process. And the conversations that emerged as a result of my messages are documented in and the centerpiece of this project. They can all be explored in depth on the project website, which is maskedcontexts.com. And they're kind of organized by these key phrases that I pulled out of the responses. I also got IP banned from Flickr on March 8th. So I started using the school computers to message Flickr users. This is the email they sent me. You can see it's addressed to Martin. That's not my name, but I became a little bit paranoid that they were tracking me. So I started using other names when I created new accounts. Turns out I was right. So I started using the school computers, but unfortunately after the school shut down due to COVID, I could no longer reach out to them and just had to use what I had at that point, which was I'd reached out to 365 users at that point and gotten 22 responses. I also became really interested in the annotations included in the COCO dataset. So COCO provides two methods of annotation, masks and captions, and you can see them here. This is a screenshot from the COCO website. Both of these methods of annotation were made by outsourced hired Amazon Mechanical Turks. The masks, as you can see, outline particular object types found within each images. So you can see these purple and green polygons that identify the child, the laptop, the chair. And the captions are meant to objectively describe each image. And these captions are used for training computer vision programs so they can learn to analyze and describe visual input. And you can see these captions above the image, and I'll read them aloud now. There's a young boy using an Apple laptop, a very cute small boy holding a big laptop. The child is proud that he can handle the big laptop. A young child holding up a silver-colored object that has stickers on it. The child has a laptop with stickers on its lid. And so juxtaposed with the image author's responses are these annotations on my website. The masks are organized into a grid of essentially incomprehensible images, and when hovered over, they come into focus and the corresponding captions are read aloud, like so.
A couple protecting their young baby with a sun umbrella and cloth. A number of cattle outside some houses. A newly married emo hipster couple sitting on a bench.
And I just want to reiterate that I did not edit these captions at all. I simply pulled them from the website and organized them in this way. These can also be viewed in juxtaposition to the conversations I had with the original photographers by hovering over the image in the response section. So on the left here, you see the response that someone sent me, and on the right is the image.
A man holding out a fork with some food on it. A man holding a fork with a glob of chocolate underneath a cute of caramel.
And so that's my project. But if I can leave you with one thing, it's to think about this. COCO is a public free data set. In terms of transparency about process and sources, it's actually relatively good. But think about larger tech companies like Facebook or Google, which don't have public data sets of this nature, but have access to tons of our data. Think about what could be in there, what some applications for those data sets are, and what that could be influencing in your life. And with that, I want to give special thanks to Richard, Anna, John, and Barbara, who were my thesis advisors throughout the year, and John, Anna, Lon, Zach, and Zena, who were my classmates who were extremely helpful throughout this process. And lastly, I want to dedicate this to my friend, Rob Height, who's an amazing artist in his own right, and whose painting has hung above my desk throughout this entire project and served as a daily inspiration for me. So with that, thank you.
Thanks so much, Noah. Congratulations on your amazing work. I'm really excited to check it out. Next up, we've got Bolar, who's also an MFA student.
Okay, hi everyone. Good evening and also good morning and good afternoon. My name is Bolar Garland. I'm a material designer and a digital fashion and sustainability strategist. My background is in fashion and textiles. And this is my thesis project, Apprenticeship 2.0, Crafting with Textiles in VR. So, human-machine symbiosis. What does this term mean? Well, the term is commonly used in the field of human-computer interaction to describe the relationship between man and technology as a partnership. In this partnership, the machines help us improve our intellectual effectiveness, making us faster thinkers, better at memorization with more capacity to store information, and so on. Some of the most seminal work on this topic by Douglas Engelbart and J.C.R. Licklider describe the process of achieving this symbiosis as human augmentation by technology. But this is only one way of thinking about human augmentation. In fact, there are a number of other ways we can conceptualize human becoming. Homo sapiens, man as the wise or knowing one, is the most predominant way we think about ourselves. But Homo faber, man as the maker, is the focus of this project. This is because an increasing number of researchers and intellectuals now argue that human intelligence is the product of fabrication as much as it is the product of Darwinian evolution by means of natural selection. And this quote by Henry Bergson, who's a French philosopher, really kind of captures the essence of this argument. It reads, "Intelligence, considered in what seems to be its original feature, is the faculty of manufacturing artificial objects, especially tools, to make tools, and of indefinitely varying the manufacture." So how can we better support the work of the Homo faber? And how can we redirect technological progress in a more human-centric direction while acknowledging man as the maker? And so what is Apprenticeship 2.0? Well, it's a digital tool, but also is an embodied learning experience. More precisely, it's a handcrafting experience that takes place in virtual reality using digital textile materials. And I set out to accomplish two things with the experience. The first one is to enable the apprentice to leverage the benefits of computation and at the same time the creative possibilities of making in VR, in effect making it possible to investigate craft and technology junctures as possible seeds for craft innovation. And two, to demonstrate the possibilities of human-machine symbiosis, to show how human hand skills and technology can coexist in ways that preserve human culture and material know-how. And so in realizing this final form, three things became central to the project. The first one is, of course, the apprentice's hands. From engagement point of view, the hands were important enablers of an embodied, authentic interaction. The second one is materiality and realistic simulation of the behavior of different physical materials that the apprentice can then learn. And finally, the third one is the importance of time. In Japan, the word takumi, which is Japanese for artisan, is used to refer to master craftsmen or women who have an uncompromising commitment to their work. The takumi spend decades honing their skill, and it is said that it takes up to 60,000 hours of training to become a true takumi. But to achieve this level of commitment, the takumi embraces mindful repetition where crafting becomes intuitive and second nature. It appears then that it is precisely this slow, repetitive journey to becoming a master craftsperson that instills in the maker patience, persistence, material know-how, and also awareness of resource limitations. And it is these values that are devoid of economic and social conditions that I wanted to focus on and to instill in the digital craft apprentice in this craft experience. And this video shows the vision I had in the beginning where a rope would be tracked in full resolution through a camera and all of the deformations of the rope would be captured in order to simulate what is being made as a virtual object. The virtual object is what you see in the top left corner of the screen. And there are many advantages to having a physical rope interface. Firstly, by tracking this rope, it will be possible to capture both the perfections and imperfections resulting from the human hand. Secondly, a physical rope interface would essentially retain all of the tactile aspects of manipulating a physical material. These are things like texture, temperature, and the weight of the material and so on. And I also experimented with various sensors and computer vision techniques to be able to track the physical rope. But there's a certain level of fine granularity that is needed to fully capture the flaws and imperfections, as well as the perfections resulting from making with one's hands. And these techniques each presented unique technical challenges. So I shifted to using lip motion, which is a hand tracking technology, to track both hands and use this hand data to manipulate a virtual rope material in VR. In here, you can see an earlier implementation prototype that was essentially an experience where you can create 3D lines to create 3D forms in VR. A later version of this prototype was tested with different people, people with craft and non-craft backgrounds. Their feedback reveals that even without a haptic glove or other kind of physical interface to give real tactile feedback, the interaction actually still felt real and intuitive and embodied. And 3 other key insights from these tests were centered on the notions of preservation, time, and creativity. Several users commented on the potential to use this technology to document and preserve specific craft techniques that are critically endangered. The comments about time emphasized that with more time, users felt like they would be able to get a good handle on what the potential and little nuances are of this tool, and that they would be able to, over time, learn the tool and its material properties and leverage them to design more liberally. And in terms of the creative stimulus that a VR setting provides, one user specifically commented on the open sky and ocean view used in this earlier prototype that you can see in these pictures on the left, as giving the feeling of anything can be made, with this tool. And these images also show the outputs from the test with 3 craft people. And so based on the insights gathered through user testing and further analysis of all previous iterations, the final experience was designed to emphasize the significance of time, material know-how, and the benefits made possible by leveraging computation. The significance of time is revealed in the experience using time-based elements, such as day and night and seasonal cycles. And as the apprentice spends more time crafting inside the experience, the visible experiential change in the surrounding environment can act as gentle nudges to the apprentice to continue making progress in what they craft, while also acting as complement to the progress the apprentice is making. And so, in addition to making these things with our hands, making things with our hands can be described as an incremental feeling one's way through the world that is stripped of grand plans. And in the field of embodied learning, this interaction with our environment is described to be what determines man. The argument here is that man's tool is a part of the world which he makes and interacts with, and that in itself also determines man in return. And so it would not be unfounded to then say that the tool here is the teacher, and that man and his tool are in a continuous cycle of reciprocity. And this intimate relationship with our tools can only be established over time as we transition from novice to expert. So here is a short future development, my focus will be on investigating possible implications of this coupling of technology and craft for the purpose of craft innovation. We now see an increasing collaboration between craftspeople and mathematicians and engineers and material scientists to design novel material properties. So my question would be, how can we leverage this technology to design new materials that do not exist yet? And with that said, I would like to end my presentation by thanking my thesis supervisors, Harpreet, Loretta, Neska, and Anna. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank other DT faculty who informed and shaped this project at different stages, including John Sharp, Ben Travis, and Kyle Lee. And finally, I would like to also thank my family for their never-ending support throughout the development of this project. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bolar. It's a beautiful project, and I'm excited to see where you take it next. All right, so to wrap up the first session, we have Brooke, who's a BFA student, and their project is titled Dark Matter Optimizer 1, the Performance of Autonomous Systems.
Hi, my name is Brooke Smith, and I'm a recently graduated Design and Technology BFA student, and I'm going to talk about my thesis research and work, the current iteration of which is entitled Dark Matter Optimizer 1 Patrol. This work is an autonomous machine and performance that explores emergent bias through programmed mechanical elements and sculpture. This is an initial contemplation of the contrast between how algorithmic systems are authored and how they are presented as dogmatic fact. This work aims to play into the austere, highlight the absurd, and reference the human hand in algorithmic automation. This steel machine currently contains a motorized linear slider system, custom electronics, and a wirelessly connected central server and database that produce the logic for the machine. The linear slider system moves a platform along the x-axis of the machine as a performer drops dark matter, a black slime-like substance that I created, into the top of the machine. The machine responds to the actions of a performer by reorienting its movement patterns and speeds. This learning is achieved through instructions received from the server and database that collects information throughout the performance related to when and where this material hits the sliding platform. The underlying programming and learning of the machine reference heuristics central to geographic crime mapping and police surveillance algorithmic products, such as Predpol and Comstat. On a basic level, the programming implements a positive feedback loop in which the history of the machine's training causes an initial bias that eventually becomes reinforced over the course of a given performance. As the machine is increasingly instructed to concentrate in certain areas, the likelihood of collecting more information of events within those areas increases as well, much like crime mapping algorithms. The real goal of this machine is not to serve as a materialized data visualization of them. The surveillance and optimization of a strange liquidescent substance is nonsensical. The aim of this project is to critique the use of algorithmic results as oracles suggesting divine answers to problems such as patrolling and mapping behavior. So I'm going to play a condensed version of the documentation of a performance of this work and then talk more about the background and future plans for this project. This work is inspired by a reflection I returned to throughout my research process. Modern-day machine learning algorithmic patterns are a choreography. They emerge as a result of the variables that are chosen to watch, the ones that are chosen to be disregarded, the weight those variables are given, the hardware and software used to watch those variables, how the results of algorithmic processes are evaluated, and who evaluates them. So I became very interested in the idea that algorithmic products like police patrolling softwares and the systems that they lean upon and animate are really an orchestra of carefully selected parts, each playing a specified and scripted role. Through this continued investigation, I found some underlying structural commonalities that linked the goals and methodologies of some of the algorithms that I was interested in, and I began organizing them in theoretical groups. I found that some algorithms targeted and exploited people explicitly based on their disadvantage, such as payday loans and for-profit college targeting. I've been calling these algorithms nets. I found other algorithmic systems surveil and punish based on spatial historical models of behavior, such as police patrolling algorithms and criminal sentencing algorithms. I've been calling these algorithms patrols. Lastly, I found another common approach was heuristics that centered around optimizing the rejection of bad options based on binary definitions of good, such as resume scanners, loan and insurance application risk assessment, and mental health screening. I've been calling these approaches filters. So this investigation led me to utilize the machine as a conceptual lens to examine these algorithms. Specifically, I was interested in the process of designing, authoring, and choreographing mechanical elements into a contained packaged unit and embedding it with a goal and instructing a performer how to utilize it as a tool. One unexpected result of these initial performative experiments was the sound generated by the machine. This was caused by the amplified vibrations of the motor against the machine as the machine changed speeds and directions. Other artifacts produced were the canvases generated by physical stains and clusters of goo that collected on the seamless papers beneath the machine. So material that did not collide with the platform and therefore was not accounted for in the machine's learning and updated movement pattern. These two works act as interesting contradictions of one another, while the sound produced are a result of the machine's responsiveness to the input material. The canvases represent all the potential data points the machine did not capture. This machine is an artifact of and for my continued research within the space of mechanical choreography, emergent behaviors, analog machine learning, and the relationship between viewer, performer, and author of algorithmic systems. In addition to elaborating on the performative side of this piece, I'm really interested in doing a work around patenting these machines that I create. This would be a writing, documentation, and performance project that plays on the language of how companies producing these algorithms position them as products, and an investigation into modern software patenting vernacular. The central inquiry of this project would be exploring the intersection of trust and uncertainty within the comprehension of nuanced technologies. My long-term goal is to make a series of machines based on structural feedback loops central to harmful algorithmic methodologies. Specifically, these machines at their core would draw inspiration from the theoretical categories of nets, patrols, and filters that I identified in my research. I would eventually like to build a machine economy in which different mechanical processes are choreographed in a symphony of exchange. The aim would be to explore and comment on how systematic bias emerges between three separate mechanical systems when they rely on the correlational assumptions of one another. Thank you to everyone who's listening and taking interest in a deeper dive into this project.
Great. Thank you everyone for sharing their work. I'm continuously humbled by all of you and your ambition to just try new things. So I guess let's start off the first session's Q&A. So before we start, let me introduce Dr. Pinar Yildiz, who will be leading the first session. So Dr. Pinar Yildiz is an infradisciplinary architect and an assistant professor at UC San Diego. Her work develops within biological sciences and digital technologies with a focus on posthumanism, eco-nihilism, Anthropocene, and feminist technoscience. If all goes well, she will be representing the oceans in the Venice Architecture Biennale in the fall. So Pinar, when you're set, we're ready to go.
Hello, everyone. This is really, really interesting, nice. And I am an educator myself, and we've moved into this new platform, remote teaching, trying to figure out what to do with our exhibitions and presentations. And I'm really impressed by what you're doing today here. You're really setting a good example. So this is wonderful. Thank you so very much. Since in the interest of time, I'm just going to jump right into my set of questions that I prepared basically. So what I would like to do is ask some questions. There is really not enough time to go over all the intricacies of these projects. So if I'm butchering your projects a little bit, please, don't hate me. it's because we don't have much time. So I'm going to start with Jeffrey. Jeffrey, I loved the flags you're making. There is a tradition in the art starting with Jasper Johns, or even international artists like nowadays for Anthropocene, an Anthropocene flag that's made of smoke has been designed. So flag making is something, and you're bringing this together with AI. And looking at your work, I immediately thought about this notion called greebles. And this is a term that comes from psychology and cognitive neuroscience. It's basically a way to study the psychological perception of objects. And greebles are basically forms. I was going to put it in my background, but the link doesn't work. They're basically objects that don't look like anything. It's really impossible to tell what they are just by looking at them. But through certain exposure to them, we start seeing them as individuals or characters. And this is thanks to the physiform gyrus. So as a sculptor, I'm just going to, skip all the conceptual framework because I think you've done an impeccable job. I think my question is, as a maker to a maker, as a sculptor to a sculptor, how important it is for you that these objects at the end become recognizable to the rest of your community?
That's an excellent question. I think that I thought a lot about that. The goal is to have them rest on the phenomenon of like pareidolia, so where the brain recognizes like faces and shapes and things in places where they might not necessarily be. Excellent, greebles. I wrote that down. And so yes, I want them, the goal is absolutely for them to be recognizable. But on the other hand, not necessarily competing, but parallel and different goal is for them to be recognizably digital and also something that a human could never have come up with. So it's sort of it's a not an easy circle to square there. But yes, the absolutely having them be recognizable. I mean, if you look at like the side profile of this thing, it looks like a gun.
It does.
And then hopefully the flag is recognizable. But I think the other thing is that ideally these things would be like much larger in form and would be able to be viewed in physical space.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I have a website where you can actually manipulate them with your mouse and sort of tumble them in space, but it's not the same. And that's sort of also a central contention of the project.
Mm-hmm. But I do think that they can be easily scalable as well. And I think you're nailing your goal a lot here. So thank you so much. I have more questions to ask you, but perhaps we'll do it privately. I'm moving on to Ray. So Ray, I really enjoyed your chairs, and as a reference, I just immediately thought about the Galactic Senate chamber, the ultimate meeting hall, but also sort of a panopticon. And if you watched all the movies of Star Wars, it's just like, a big fight happens here between Yoda and Senator Paladin. So I was thinking about that. And now the question that I have for you is, the first chair apparently was invented in 2680 BC in Egypt. And it wasn't a democratic chair. It was something that was perfected for the royalty. So we can think of chair as furniture, a piece of furniture that's already kind of a most iconic piece of furniture for civilization, which in and of itself is kind of hierarchical, right? So because not everybody has access to a chair when it's first invented. Now, I think my larger question to you is, and again, I'm skipping a lot, which is a lot of valuable, input that's in your work. Do you think that democracy can be embedded in architecture? This is a big question, but in your specific case, can it be integrated in design of furniture?
Thanks, Pinar. Great to meet you here. I think, to answer that question, it's really interesting because I think from all the research, one of the the big things I've found is actually that, chairs or really anything in space, and actually it's very important right now, by the way, in COVID-19, because we are our space. We only have our space to deal with. But everything that's in there is actually influencing very subtly everything that we know and do, including the temperature of the room. Like temperature of the room causes aggression, for example. Colors of the room, when it's red, you react faster. There are just so many little things that add up over time and everything. And I think it's, to get to your question, it's really interesting to see how to basically come up with a fair playground for people. Like just to have a place where, like you were saying, it's democratic, right? Like it's everybody actually has the same place in the table. But I think what my work is also showing is that inherently it is very difficult to achieve, right? Like, kind of everything that you put in the room, including where the door is, automatically you're associated with different things. So for example, in some of the work that I was doing research on, people who love sitting in corners actually talk a lot more to their neighbors, right? Like, so why corners? They could sit next to each other on the table, but actually it turns out it's on the corner. I mean, these are just so many subtle influences. And I think one way to maybe get at the question of how to have these kind of equality of access and how to have everyone basically, you have a place, like literally a place on the table, is to first figure out all those things which makes it so that there's inherent biases, kind of like map out those different things. So, and I think in my work in particular, it's not only mapping out the space, but what I'm saying actually the particular gestures that these machines will have. Because what I'm saying also is that these machines in the future aren't just going to just sit there. They are going to move around and they're going to be able to remap these spaces, right? They're going to go from a meeting room to a TV watching room to a talk room to a Zoom Skype room that we have right now, And so I think what I'm saying is that because you're gonna go even more and more complex in the future, we really do need to know more and more about how these interactions, the space and also the gestures actually affect the way that we interpret things and the way that we are biased towards making decisions in different ways and therefore making it not equal for everyone involved.
Well, that's wonderful. And you're already thinking way ahead of our time right now, because just the COVID-19 has shown us that perhaps our democracy is also, it needs to be revised a little bit. So perhaps we can't figure out a truly democratic architecture before figuring out democracy itself. But I'm very amused and fond of your work. Thank you so much, Ray. I'm moving on to Karen. So Karen, I'm also trained as an architect, and your presentation really spoke to me directly. Just, having spent countless hours dealing with AutoCAD, which was a hellish nightmare. And perhaps the one reason that I didn't, get my license to be a practicing architect because I hated it. But then you move on to this idea of a latent space. I wanted to bring forth an architect who is very dear to me, Livius Woods. And in my background, I have an image by him. Here's a quote from him. Architects are idea people. We have concepts and make designs that embody or implement them. We present them as clearly and openly as possible and can only hope that others will find them useful to their ends and build them. And this is coming from an architect who has been architecturally sterile. He didn't really build anything, didn't care much. So now there are some architects today that call this latent space of AI as a dream space, right? And then looking into your work, we can think of it as architecture dreaming, right? And this is probably not a very, great metaphor, because the way dreams work in our brain and the way latent space works is very different. But as much as dreams are great, they also don't make sense all the time. But architecture has to make sense, right? So what are your thoughts moving forward with this project and like with the forms that you're creating? Again, this is also perhaps something that is connected to what Jeffrey is doing, because you're after creating forms that can cannot be perhaps made by just the human mind itself or the tools that are available to us, but coming from the intelligence of the machines. So what are your thoughts in terms of, the buildability, I just made that word, the architecture that you're creating, and whether it would be built or not? Like, is that something important to you? Is that a direction that you want to pursue?
Thank you for this question. For me, I wasn't really thinking about if it's going to be buildable or not. I was really questioning the ways we design and the ways we think of design. So when I started this project, I knew that we think of AutoCAD, we think of a slab and a concrete wall and then columns and all these things. And I was thinking of how can we, like, these methods are based on the tools that we use. So how can, if we change our tools or if we change our ways of thinking, would we be able to restart or like change the way we design these elements? Because like the ways that built environment is designed now, it's still like the same since the industrial era. So and there's a movement called like a discrete architecture. So can we move into designing with different computational methods, and how would that affect actually how we start designing? So my project is more of a one step into this new world of designing using pixels or designing using voxels. But I don't think that it's directly linked to directly buildable now. But it depends on the data set and it depends on what you train it on. It could lead to actual designs probably.
There's an architect, Sebastian Errázuriz, who recently said that 90% of architects will lose their jobs as artificial intelligence takes over the design process. So what's your response to that?
No, I don't think that's ever going to be the case. I think architecture is not just about form. I think it's more about like the sensibility of how you design a space. And there's so many different elements that go into architecture that can be really based on the machine. It can dictate like human sensibility to things. So like it can help you lay out things and it can help you on a very organizational level, but I don't think it can help you on design very specifically.
Well, thank you so much, Karen. And again, very beautiful work and very inspired. I'm moving on to Noah. So Noah, first off, I love Memo Aktan's work myself, and I actually work super hard to bring him to UC San Diego, and he will be starting his position here in the fall if all goes well. I don't want to jinx it. But your project was very, very interesting to me, also because it has this kind of sense of humor embedded in it, although that's not the goal. And you asked at the very end, you asked us to think about the implications of this. And I actually wanted to ask you, like, what do you see as the biggest peril of this, these systems like COCO?
Oh, I think the biggest peril is that your question?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think as I kind of hinted at in my project, these algorithms are making more and more decisions in our life, right? And there's this kind of invisible layer about how they work. We call it like a black box, right? We throw data in and then it makes decisions. And I think the danger is like the common saying, garbage in, garbage out. Like we don't know what's going in and fueling those decision making. And every time there seems to be an investigation into a AI that's making decisions that maybe we're not there yet, we find huge issues with bias and racism, and basically all the issues that we have as people are being embedded in our AIs. So I think that's probably the biggest peril.
Well, thank you so much, Noah. I'm going to move on to Bulor. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right.
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you.
Okay, Bulor. It's I was also looking at your other work when I received your links from Allison. It's just so beautiful work. I really want to, have your designs around me. It's gorgeous work, but it's also, again, as someone who started drawing very early, and I also built things. I used to build my sculptures just using my hands, and I used to draw a lot. And now most of my work takes place in the digital platform, right? And I know how frustrating it can be to make a rope in ZBrush, for instance. Like, you know what you want, but it's so hard to get there. So I'm really hopeful. It gives me hope to see, tools like the one you're working on coming from people with this kind of sensitivity. But I just wanted to ask you, again, you mentioned this in your presentation, so obviously you're thinking about this, but the haptics, the tangible context will definitely be missing, and dexterity is something that also happens with like touch. We have amazing touch receptors in our hands that guide us, right? Our cerebellum is always at work orchestrating movement, and part of this expertise of building, making by hand is, training these systems repeatedly, which doesn't necessarily translate to virtual platforms. So what is your vision for that? Like, are you after, let's say, a full, replica, or are you more interested in just improving your tool to what it can become within the limitations of this, software? So it's not a very clear question, because I'm also like, I get inspired by tools like this, but at the same time, it's like chocolate milk with a little drop of poison to me. Like, I want to drink it, but I also don't want to drink it, so just wanted to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. That's a really great question. So I think there are two directions that we can go with this kind of tool. One is, as you said, replicating existing techniques and really trying to capture all of those tactile sensations that we get from manipulating a material and learning how a particular material behaves, right? And that can be applied in the context of craft preservation, where we now have, craft techniques that are actually extinct or considered critically endangered. And so some of the prototypes I showed where I'm trying to track a physical rope, and there was that sort of infinite rope idea where you connect two pieces of a rope together to create a knot, and then you undo that knot, and then you connect the pieces again, and then you create another knot. So those prototypes kind of went in that direction, where I was really trying to retain all of those tactile sensations. And I think that's definitely something I'll continue working on to improve on and to really sort of track that physical material and bring that into the digital world. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think also it's important to acknowledge what computation allows us to do with digital materiality. So without sort of being constrained by the physical properties of existing materials that behave in certain ways, can we kind of move to a digital sphere where we're able to now, design and manipulate materials in ways that we cannot imagine now? How can we kind of leverage computation and design materials that are programmable, that, maybe like self-assemble, and just kind of use the tool as this type of tool for craft innovation. So I think I'm kind of interested in both, and I would love to experiment with more sort of different types of technologies and different sort of materialities to kind of actualize both, really.
That's wonderful. And I really want to keep an eye on the software, and I want to use it myself. As a note, I thought you might find, this is kind of like a very canonic text, but a Simulacra and Simulation by Baudrillard. Yes, you're already nodding your head. Yeah, it's a really good book, isn't it? But thank you so much. I must move to Brooke Smith in the interest of time. Brooke, are you there?
Hi, yes. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really excited to be here with you guys. Now, I loved this machine. It's just so proper, but so messy at the same time. And I immediately thought about, as you talked about the petrol algorithms, etc., Minority Report. I'm of a generation where I actually watched this film and it was popular. And now when I talk to my students about it, they're like, Minority Report, we never heard about it. So I'm just putting the image in the background. This is, a speculation on the future of, let's say, the police department predicting crime with algorithms. Right? This is a future that's been imagined. Now, this is tangential to your work. I think what really stays with me looking at your work is I think of them as perhaps diagrams, and during your presentation you showed some charts and diagrams that you made, and I immediately thought about Peter Eisenman, the architect, and his diagram diaries, where he talks about the significance of diagrammatic thinking in design. So I was just wondering, again, like, you're building these tangible multi-modal diagrams to me, but is that your intention really to kind of make them also readable to people, to the audiences who are coming into, perhaps a set of these machines working together, making the beautiful and uncanny sounds they're making? Or are you just interested in, let's say, summarizing it for yourself and completing this diagram for yourself?
So I think, especially with the work that I showed, I was the most interested in the latter, not necessarily just making it for myself, but as a way as maybe conveying like the eeriness and otherworldliness of these like machine qualities that when I think of the algorithms that I'm commenting on, they're so weird and wild, and it's insane to me how they are like implemented and really engaging these systems, all of the weird, insane results that they produce, and biases, like uncertain, I guess, basically like all of the lead offs that come from those like algorithmic implementations.
Right.
I think.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. But I think in terms of like the underlying mechanics, programming, even like things about how information is siloed with the machine and how it's passed back and forth, is a way of me underlying the like perceived presented machine artifact and like performance, understanding and commenting on like some of like how that information is passed around. So it is like very much like a personal research project in the sense of like, what is the cause and effect relationship between these like program dynamics? But I think like the takeaway that I really want people to receive, and eventually as I like continue to work on it, is the weird, eerie, like otherworldliness of them.
Well, thank you so much. Allison, I think we have to stop, right? Because you have another set coming up.
I think we're actually going to skip the break, but thank you.
I'm so sorry. I actually have more questions to all of you. Brooke, especially, like, I liked how you mentioned this as a choreography as well. And thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm very inspired seeing your work. And I wish you the best with your projects. And I'll keep an eye on where they are headed. Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much. All right. So as you may have heard me say, we're going to have to skip the 5-minute break since we're a bit over time. So next up, to kick off the second session, I'd like to introduce my dear friend, John Packles, who is an MFA student.
Hey, everybody. Just a moment. Oh, man.
You've got this, John. All right, so I guess we are going to get our short break as John figures out how to share his presentation. So why don't we all reconvene in 2 minutes at 7:30?
Sounds good. Thanks, Alice.
No worries. John, just give us the go ahead if you're ready.
Sure. If you want to move on to the next presenter, while I figure this out, appreciate it. Thank you.
No worries. All right. So next up, we've got Cassandra, who is an MFA student, and she will be presenting her work, Z Network. Just give a few seconds to have that queued up.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for coming to our virtual space today. I'm super pleased to be here. My name is Cassandra Herdeel, and today I want to talk a little bit about my work around libraries, oppression, and catalog interfaces. I also want to give you all a trigger warning that this talk briefly mentions the topic of sexual assault. So the Zine Network project is a radical interface that describes the holdings of the Barnard Zine Library, a collection of 5,300 zines with an emphasis on works by queer authors, women and non-binary authors, and authors of color. The Barnard Zine Library is cataloged by zine librarian Jenna Friedman, who I believe is here today, so hi Jenna. Zines are texts that are largely self-published, self-printed, and self-assembled. They stand outside the traditional model of publishing, circulating instead in informal networks of friends, fairs, and art festivals. So here's an example of a really cool text in the Barnard Zine Library. This is Quarrel. Quarrel is subtitled as Stories of Survivor Self-Determination, Direct Action, Strategies for Safer Spaces, and Ripping Patriarchy to Shreds. So I want us to all just take a moment and think about what kinds of words, ideas, values, and communities you associate with this text, just based on what these pages look like. Now, here is how Quarrel is categorized using the Library of Congress's official subject headings. So the keywords that we have here are political activists, rape, direct action, and patriarchy. Okay. Sort of. This is maybe one way to describe what this text is, but it's definitely a pretty limited way. And this is a very typical example of what happens to a text like this when it's cataloged in a library system. It gets kind of flattened. Library metadata uses normative Eurocentric organization to categorize non-normative collections. The Library of Congress subject headings, which are exemplified here, are the standardized terms used to classify library holdings throughout most of the world. They are also notoriously conservative, heteronormative, and colonial in nature. K.R. Roberto, a queer activist cataloger and librarian, works specifically around the terms that are used to describe queer subjects in this system. Roberto tells us, instead of GLBT or LGBT people, sexual minorities is the authorized form for these terms. Removing queerness from the catalog does not eliminate it. Rather, it creates a space that only values clearly delineated identities. No matter what the terminology says, queerness is still present in the catalog. Its explicit invisibility haunts LCSH. In the case of a collection like Barnard's, where many queer researchers go to find works by other queer people, this is a representation problem. There is a mismatch between how a user or reader sees themselves and what they see reflected of themselves within the system. I want to nuance this critique a little. The catalog contains oppressive organization, but it also contains opportunities for resistance within its own data systems. Jenna Friedman uses a data field known as a local note field to describe the unique physical appearance and content of zines with content-rich summaries. These summaries, which become searchable in the catalog, are one way of achieving the discoverability that subject headings are supposed to provide without dealing with the ill-fitting and biased language of the standard Library of Congress headings. So here's a summary of Coral that lives in that field. I won't read the whole thing aloud because of time constraints, but I want to note that the description contains the phrases prison industrial complex and manarchist, both of which I am pretty sure the Library of Congress does not know, and certainly would not use as subject headings even if they did. Jenna also uses another local note field to apply custom genres to the zines in the collection. These genres stem from the form of the zines themselves, and so are descriptive in a way that traditional metadata simply cannot be, because traditional metadata was not designed to hold materials like these. So if we actually go and look at the data, this is what we see: a beautiful content-rich description, followed by those awful Library of Congress headings, followed by the custom zine genre fields. With this stark contrast, the data is telling a really compelling story about the contradictions of its own classification. Activist librarian and scholar Emily Drabinski writes that applying a queer analysis to library data requires that we steer clear of correction of problematic subject headings or metadata, and instead invite the user to grapple with it. She suggests that, quote, designing search interfaces that make related and broader terms visible to users so that they can understand how materials are linked in the knowledge organization scheme is one of many ways to reveal points in the classification structure through which the power might leak out, end quote. Drabinski's approach of invitation and of showing, rather than merely correcting, is at the heart of this project. Visualizations, after all, are attempts to show. When we apply an organization system to a set of things, we are creating a landscape, a geography that tells us something about how to read the information. That begs the question, what are the features of the geographies that we are making? If we map out these systems with all their biases, oppressions, and normativity, what do they actually look like? And how can these maps help us navigate the fraught landscapes that has been created, in many cases, long before we even got here? In the zine network visualization, the zine genres shape the broad geography of the collection with colorful neighborhoods. Upon a closer look, boundaries are fluid, as most zines in the collection claim more than one category. Here, we have visual confirmation that not only is the personal political, but the personal zine is the political zine, which is also the art zine. The visual landscape that is created by zine genres is one that embraces the multiplicity and overlap of its inhabitants' categories, a far cry from the space of the catalog that values only clearly delineated identities, as Roberto has told us. In this visualization, Friedman's custom genre fields ensure that the contours of the landscape are formed by data that is specific to zines and respectful of the ethos of the collection. However, it is also important to imagine visualizations that are based on the other data that hold this collection. That includes the Library of Congress subject headings. Visualizing how these subject headings shape the collection is part of the process of inviting the user to grapple with them, per Drabinski. The landscape of the Barnard Zine Library's holdings and classification system is complex. It is a geography that contains some wonderful classification, thanks to Jenna, and some deeply problematic classification, thanks to the Library of Congress. My hope is that some good maps of this landscape will help researchers and students who use the library see both. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cassandra, for your amazing work. All right, so next up, we're going to have John come back on. After all, this wouldn't be a DT event without a tech glitch. So go ahead, John.
Thanks, Allison. I just wanted to keep the production team on their toes, see if they could handle an audible. So thanks, everybody, for coming. And before by the way, can you see the, no, I'm paranoid. Can you see everything okay? Okay, great.
Yeah, we can.
Before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge that my thesis professor, Richard Tay, introduced me to Mimi's work in my first couple of weeks at DT. And she's did it with the pursuit of turning personal data, the stuff that we create passively through everyday activity like browsing the web or commuting to work, into a form that highlights it as a material and makes it accessible, makes it tangible, in some cases maybe makes it useful and maybe even meaningful for the people whose stories that this data tells. And the impetus for this inquiry is really twofold. On one hand, I'm amazed at this material, how much we can learn about ourselves and our communities from it, what things we can make out of it. And I consider this a pursuit worthy end in itself. But by engaging deeply in this data, it's really impossible to ignore the more critical questions of ownership and agency, like why is this data being collected in the first place? What systems enable this type of collection? Who stands to benefit? And do I, as an individual, have a say in this story that gets assembled from this data? Think again about the photo analogy. So last year, I learned about Google Takeout, and that's a service that allows users to download copies of the data of theirs being stored on Google servers, like email correspondences, browser histories, location, all data that, it's worth noting, is recorded by default. So I requested some data and I downloaded it, and the file that stood out to me was called myactivity.json, and it contained 80,000 search queries that I've typed in the last 10 years of my life. And this felt like stumbling on an old journal, but this journal is one that I actually stuck to, and I'd been consistent with it, and I'd been logging it daily without knowing for a really good portion of my life. And as I waded through this file in my text editor before I really learned how to parse it with JavaScript, I was shocked at how intimate, often embarrassing, sometimes poetic this text was. It was a window into some of the most intimate details of my life. And yet it was in a form that's meant to be read by a machine, not read by people. So needless to say, I got hooked on this data set. And for the last several months, I've been designing and building tools for parsing, processing, and presenting my Google search history in different ways. So I'm going to show a couple examples of the outputs that I created. So My goal here is to give the data a form that makes it feel more like a personal archive than a data set, and a form that allows me to engage with it, engage in the work and the joy of sorting, sharing, organizing, making sense of, and filling the gaps in of this document, which otherwise we don't get to do. And from there, after I got sick of basking in my own memories, I wanted to make this experience accessible to others. So a selection of the tools that I built are now available at searchrecord.net. And it's easy to engage with this tool and the artifacts that I've made and have this feeling of kind of delight. And these are really playful things that I've built here and lighthearted, and that's intentional. I want this project to be approachable. And then there's this feeling that maybe creeps up a little later. What else is out there about me? What is this being used for? And I've found in working in this space that the hardest thing to respond to when talking about data privacy is this argument of, I have nothing to hide, why should I be concerned? And the people that write and theorize and teach about data think that's crazy. But that's not crazy, because the term data is cold and distant, yet what it contains is anything but that. And I think that if we start to think about personal data as something small, something truly personal, maybe these high-level concerns become a little bit easier to grasp. And in the meantime, we can use these documents for our own good. Thank you to everybody that helped me with this project. There's more than I can list here. But I am excited to continue building this, and thank you all for listening.
Thanks so much, John. Congratulations. All right, next up, we've got Lon, who is an MFA student as well.
Hi, everyone. This is Lon. Cool. So, is everyone able to see my screen? I assume yes. My year-long thesis research is around the topic of computational comedy, which stands for using procedural methods to produce comic text from borrowed resources. And the final manifestation of this research is this application, like this web interface, where you will actually be able to write with these different virtual stand-up comedians of your choice. You can write with them, they will complete your sentences, and hopefully throughout that process, you get to explore different condensed themes and identities embedded in these materials. So before I actually walk you guys through the whole process, just a little introduction of what I mean when I say hack comedy. So for most of them that you know, typically hack is like, the computer hackers, the network hackers. But for those that don't know, hack is also a term that's widely used in the comedy landscape when they're trying to refer to jokes that are considered obvious, that are copied from other authors or from people that are just always using other people's materials. So that's exactly kind of what I'm doing here at the intersection of both programming and comedy. And speaking of why I explore kind of this direction in the first place, English was not my first language, and I struggled to feel culturally competent. So I was really trying to kind of use this way of programming and computational creativity to kind of reach or hack into that landscape of American humor pedestal. However, I didn't become a comedian, so this kind of whole process actually kind of absurdity in itself. It also kind of reinforced the failure of my ideal pursuit. Most went to take improv class, but I'm kind of glad I didn't. Okay, so going back to the interface, it's pretty straightforward. You kind of have 3 steps over here. With the first one, you get to select any of the comedians. If I click open 3 of them, then these 3 individual modules that have these comedians' name will pop up. And you have these 3 modes available for you to pick to interact with these different modules. The default mode is writing mode, which pretty much means if you go into this text box and you start typing just part of the sentences, the Z-Sensari module in this case will complete writing your sentences with word and references that are from Z-Sensari's resources. So if you wonder what those sources are, you can click Show Source, and it's going to list all these transcripts that I scraped from the internet that I built these modules with. And these modules are N-gram Markov chain model based. So it's a statistic mathematic models that kind of predicts how specific events, how likely one event would happen after the other event. So yeah, with these individual different modules, you can type anything and it's going to use the words and references from the source, as I said before. But if you type in like gibberish, for example, it's automatically kind of end your sentence with a period because there's no direct reference or way for it to grab any words to complete the sentences. So yeah, that's the writing mode, and you can clear all the input individually, or you can go straight to the next mode, which I call it group improv, and just hit clear all output. So what is group improv? The biggest difference from this mode and write mode is you can type in one user input and you can have all these modules to kind of output contents at the same time. So you can really be able to compare with one prompt or one specific theme that you want to explore. You can see what words are being used by different comedians, just having them side by side, and that's usually hard to do if you're just putting in their videos together. So that's the group improv mode. And with ranting mode, it's you pretty much, I'm going to close the show source over here. You type in the amount of words you want all the current selected comedian modules to rant for. Let's say I chose 50 words. Once you hit start, they're just going to start ranting on its own. It's going to come out much more random and ridiculous because the algorithm over here is slightly adjusted. So the next predictable word is only using the previous word as reference rather than a whole sentence. So part of this application, which is writing mode, was used as a tool for performance that I delivered in March at La Mama Experimental Theater, where I actually had human actors to kind of verbally perform out the generated output with a MATLAB style skeletons. And for tonight, 2 of them are actually joining us, and we're going to do a little demo. So let's welcome Caleb and Xiao. If you guys can unmute yourself and turn your on camera and just say hi so I know you're there.
Hey, can you hear me?
Howdy. Yes. Oh, cool. So we have Caleb and Xiao. So for the March performance, we actually had a whole flushed out 3 different types of writing, MATLAB style skeletons, and we had the actors to kind of perform these outputs differently based on the style of the corpus. But for today, we're just going to have each of them pick a comedian, and I'm just going to use kind of part of the whole skeleton that we used just to do a little demo and to entertain everyone a little bit. Okay, cool. Let me know who you want to pick, Caleb and Xiao.
I'll go with Kevin Hart.
Kevin Hart.
Bill Moore, please.
Bill Moore. Okay, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And the corpus we're going to do is Genesis 1 to 11, the beginning from the Bible. It's going to be really weird, so bear with us.
In the beginning, God created the real shit, and the baby are looking at each other.
And the earth was born white and privileged.
I think, Xiao, you need to be a little closer to your mic. It's a little hard to hear your voice.
And the earth was born white and privileged, and darkness was upon
because we don't have an output for that. Creative code.
And the Spirit of God moved upon the blinds. And God said, "Let there be able to." And there was about to be that guy until my best friend, Harry, showed up in my house with his 2-year-old baby. And God saw the signs, emotions, feelings, all over the goddamn place. That it was real. Because when we start going down, this lady, she was like, "He got my baby." And God divided the fuck up from the right and smacked her head on the glass on the left-hand side.
And God called the best brain and everything. Your take on is an incredible success. You won the trade war. You built the wall. You effortlessly solved the Middle East. And Stormy Daniels is still basking in the afterglow of your incredibly lovely. And the darkness he owned and mourners are being asked in lieu of flowers to just leave their car engine running. And the evening, the morning, and the morning were the only group that has a bias against themselves.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Love money. We hate you.
Because for the time, we're going to stop there. But thank you so much, Shao. Thank you so much, Caleb, for entertaining us and bringing your amazing performance out here. And yeah, that's going to be a wrap for this interface. Go ahead and try it out and explore this interface with all these different virtual comedians on your own. Thank you so much. Oh, you can find it at www.hackcomedy.net. Yay, peace.
Thanks, Lon. Such a cool project. Next up, we've got Shirley, who's an MFA student, and her project is titled Alternative Realities, Protect Me from What I Want.
Hi, my name is Shirley Long and I am a MFA DT student. I'm going to start off by showing a 360 clip of my video narrative.
So I've been thinking a lot about this and I've always been curious about this idea of happiness. How would you want to become happy? How would you achieve happiness? So I've always been curious about this idea of happiness. I think that it can be a sign of weakness to have a zipper on, but I think also a sign of strength. I think a zipper on is a bad sign. I think a bad sign is, it would be nice to be able to wear glasses and things that show emotion in, but I think that emotion can be a vehicle to allow you to be who you are and show emotion in a way that, I don't think we can see that in a world where humans are supposed to be, very persistent, very outgoing, and I also think that, this is a Western idea of happiness and it's always been a Western idea of happiness. And in many ways, Asian American there, middle class to lower middle class. I think that there's more to it than ethnicity. I think that there's a lot to it I'm thinking about, it actually does make.
So that's a clip of just one of the narratives. If you can't tell by the computer voiceover, these narratives are actually algorithmically generated. What I did was I had interviewed 3 Asian American women, myself being one of them, and I asked all of us to project what type of idealized future that we kind of expect for ourselves from a variety of different scenarios. best case scenario, worst case scenario, etc. And I took the transcript from all of these interviews and I had fine-tuned a natural language processing algorithm. I used OpenAI's GPT-2 and used it to generate different segments of alternative realities for these individuals. Then I took these generated alternative realities and turned it into this 360 audiovisual experience. Alternative realities, Protect Me From What I Want, is a physical installation and an immersive narrative experience. It really is a conversation between me, the artist, and participants about generative narratives around race, identity, and privilege in the Asian American community. I'm interested in interrogating our relationship with technology by using computer prediction as a way to control our own future. When I think about decision making, at least I tend to make choices based off of this vision that I want for myself in the future. And the more I think about it, the more that I realize that so much of these choices are actually constrained by society. And there's this unique relationship between ancestral migration and constraints and choices in technology. And I'm kind of interested in exploring this dynamic because I think that there's a lot to be said about the powers of control. What I was initially proposing is a interactive room installation where there are scrolls hanging from the ceiling, where each of the scrolls represent generative alternative realities for a specific individual. And one of these scrolls would feed into a black box where visitors can put on a VR headset inside the black box to experience the audio visual experience of 4 of these narratives. The experience is meant to evoke a feeling of gazing into someone's stream of consciousness. I selected these narratives and its accompanying scenes as a way to visualize what these alternative realities in the multiverse could look like, and it's important to me that it looked realistic. Currently, because of the global pandemic, I've migrated from a physical installation into a digital installation of the work. This project began as an attempt to control my own future using technology, but it is also transformed into this speculative, existential, and critical piece about the pervasive power and limitations of technology.
Great. Thanks so much, Shirley, for exploring these ideas and for sharing your work with us tonight. Next up is June, who's an MFA student. June, go for it.
Hi, everyone. All right. Can you all hear me? Okay, I'm going to assume yes. Hi, my name is June, and I'll be presenting my project, A Post-Work Renter's Paradise, which is an audio-visual essay about a post-work future where productive labor has been fully automated and the only work left for humans to perform is reproductive. So I'll first screen the film and then attempt to briefly summarize 18 months of research that informs the project.
Before history reset itself, there was work, then there was reproduction. People were once a natural resource, like fish. Our creation and recreation were valueless, an externality. Labor replaced labor, until it couldn't. full automation, and a renter's paradise are fueled by a surplus of data. Privacy is exchanged for freedom. Productivity is for robots. Motherhood, womanhood, and housewife are not biological systems. They are ideology. Within the renter's paradise, reproductive labor is collectivized. The family is extinct. We belong to a new era of relationships based on reciprocity. Children belong to themselves. The work now left for humans to perform is solely reproductive. The work is to reproduce.
To work is to care.
To work is to gestate.
To work is to fix.
To work is to maintain.
To work is to rebuild.
To work is to be a substitute.
We are the creators of each other. We exist as surrogates in collective substitution. Within the renter's paradise, we reproduce and are reproduced. Everyone is a surrogate.
So at its core, this project is a critique of the asymmetrical relationship between productive labor and reproductive labor. Reproductive labor involves all the work which produces and cares for individuals and maintains social and physical infrastructures. The care crisis that we experience today and all of its complexities and contradictions has roots in this asymmetry. The production and caring of people do not produce profit, therefore this type of work is devalued. Despite the actual increase in demand for people to perform this type of work, its wages remain stagnant and its workers live in social and economic precarity. The narrative of the film is based on a series of provocations that provide glimpses of this post-work society. To work is to reproduce, productivity is for robots, children belong to themselves, and everyone is a surrogate. When I began this project in the fall of 2018, I was initially inspired by the work of Marxist feminists and the wages for housework movements, which demand a recognition for the unpaid work that is involved in reproducing labor power. But during the thesis process, I focused my research on more contemporary sources which discuss reproductive labor as an intersectional issue. While the work of early Marxist feminists told important stories, it essentially suggests that all women, regardless of class and race, are defined by their private domestic responsibilities and neglect the voices of immigrant women, poor women, and women of color and men who have been engaged in wage reproductive work for centuries and remain marginalized to this day. Informed by these ideas, a post-work renter's paradise speculates on what the future of reproductive labor looks like if productive labor were out of the equation. In a post-work renter's paradise, to work is to reproduce. The idea behind the concept of a renter's paradise comes from Peter Frase's discussion of post-capitalist futures in his book, For Futures. phrase defines rentism as a society determined by abundance and hierarchy. The ruling class consists of an elite group of people who own and control information and the reproduction of patterns. Rentism is essentially an extension of surveillance capitalism, with corporate giants like Amazon, Google, and Facebook accumulating immense wealth through the extraction of data. Within the renter's paradise, the renters live rent-free lives in exchange for the reproduction of their data. Like the replacement of agricultural labor with industrial labor, productive labor is replaced by reproduction. In a post-work renter's paradise, productivity is for robots. Reflecting Marxist critiques of the family structure and inspired by non-biological forms of kinship, this world exists without the institution of the family as we know it today, which has been a source of oppression for many women. In a post-work renter's paradise, reproductive labor is collectivized and children belong to themselves. In Full Surrogacy Now, Sophie Lewis argues that we must not side with the anti-surrogacy movement, which further jeopardizes the security and dignity of surrogate mothers. Rather, we must work towards, quote, the dream of surrogates running surrogacy, end quote, subverting the very meaning of the word surrogate to be a relationship based on collectivity and horizontality, not on subjugation. For me, a clear answer to that is that everyone becomes a surrogate. In a post-work renter's paradise, everyone is a surrogate. So this project sits in the gray area between reality and unreality. The purpose of the aesthetic and conceptual choices is not to be didactic or representational, but expressive, ambiguous, and gestural. The provocative statements and imagery are not intended to provide answers to solving the care crisis, nor are they dystopian or utopian visions of what I think a post-work future may look like. Rather, they are thresholds for viewers to enter and a lens through which one can question the ideologies and the underlying forces that we take as fact, and view this form of work as work that makes the conditions of human existence possible. So I want to give a special thank you to Aneshka, Richard, Anna, Fiona, Tony, Shin, Melanie, and Spence for supporting me throughout this whole process. And last but not least, my husband, Tristan Lapointe, who is always performing the reproductive work of making this thesis possible. Thank you.
Thanks so much, June. Next up, we've got Eliza, who's an MFA student, and she'll be sharing her project titled Tactility and Care.
Hi, I'm Eliza. Welcome to my talk called Tactility and Care. My thesis project uncovers and reimagines the materiality of technological devices, focusing on manual care. How is the world within the technological object, and how is the technological object within the world? My project started by me questioning the material culture that is produced by technological devices and the everyday interactions that we have with them. And I started experimenting the materiality of a smartphone and exploring the nuances of the interactions afforded in different materials. So this is just a glimpse into the very early work that I did to start my project. Technological objects today are typically all screen-based and cuboid-shaped. We repeatedly swipe, hold, tilt, press, and tap screens embedded in sleek cuboids, consuming masses of information. And so we are engaged in this bodily performance that we're not entirely aware of. My technological coming of age consisted of a jumble of wires and plugs and chunky devices. I was always drawn towards the mechanisms of these objects, buttons, levers, switches, any physical parts to tinker with. The interactions I had with these parts usually had a visible causality to them that gave me some understanding of what was happening. But now all these interactions have condensed into clicking and tapping smooth surfaces, soon to disappear to be replaced solely by voice. Donna Haraway talks about cyborgs as hybrid of machine and organism, a creature of social reality. The metaphor of the cyborg portrays the body as an inescapable component of our lived experience with technology. But now, with each new advancement, more of the body disappears from the interactions we have with devices, from the body to hand to finger to being absent from the picture completely. This produces an aesthetic that detaches us from the materials and the objects themselves, since they have no texture or irregularities and they appear to effortlessly exist, seemingly without labor and infrastructure. We have high expectations from each click and tap. It is expected to always work. If it ever hesitates, pauses, or breaks down, you click and tap repeatedly, frustrated that it failed you in these technologically advanced times. There's nothing you can fiddle with and care for materially anymore as a user, except for maybe rebooting the device and hoping it works. Technology has advanced a lot since the days of me banging a CPU to get it to stop making that weird noise. Now, our technological connections are getting stronger, but our connection to materials is broken. Cyberpunk and body horror films have an intriguing contrast to present-day sleek and smooth devices. They frequently show technologies as having flesh-like organic and strained surfaces with fissures and oddities. They are hybrids of human and machine, not unlike Donna Haraway's Cyborgs. She says about technological objects, and I quote, "Made of sunshine, they are all light and clean because they're nothing but signals, electromagnetic waves, a section of a spectrum. People are nowhere near so fluid, being both material and opaque. If people are not fluid and require friction, texture, and movement, then why do our devices aim to produce a material culture that is sterile, seamless, and inert, removed from the realm of the physical?" Focusing on the emotional and material nuances of interaction brings us closer to the hardware of a technological object. The way your fingers navigate the grooves of an audio jack as it audibly plugs into place, it gives you an embodied sense of how parts connect to let signals flow. This tactile causality is what keeps us engaged with the material, and being engaged with the material is the first step of making visible these infrastructures that we never really think about. From the materials that are extracted and the human labor required to do so, to the electricity that is produced and delivered, to the server farm that is maintained and the data that is processed, and to the delivery person at your door. This project is one way of questioning and reimagining this techno-material landscape in hopes of fostering a greater sense of care and responsibility towards the materials we use and interact with. It does so through a series of technological artifacts that are shown through a short film titled An Incomplete Glossary of Technological Interactions. Now, this 3-minute film is going to play, and I would advise you to listen to it through earphones or headphones for a richer sound experience. That was a portion of the film. These are the complete contents of the incomplete glossary. And if you're interested to watch the extended version with Chapter 3 as well, called Domestic Rocks, you can find my project on our website at parsons.edu/dt.
Thanks, Eliza, for sharing your work. And last but not least, for our second session, we've got Elena, who is an MFA student, and their project is titled Querying Our Interface.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to the MFA Design and Technology Thesis livestream event. I'm so excited to share my work with you. My name is Elena Lee Gold, and my thesis is entitled Querying Our Interface. My work examines the inherent hetero and gender normative foundation that our computers, and more specifically, our internet's interface, is built on. This work focuses specifically on interface because it's the first line of interaction with our computers. Our interface often draws on metaphors that reinforce normativity. One superficial example is the metaphors that align neatly with office work of white-collar employees, such as files, folders, desktop. These emphasize that the computer was originally used as a tool solely for labor, and though our computers have new, varied uses, this metaphor still prevails. Because interface is so heavily guided by the norms of the world it was built in, it brings our society's values into its functionality and therefore into our digital world. More concretely, this might look like a non-binary person being asked to choose male or female to register for a site. But the conventional male/female drop-down interface isn't just an oversight, it's a profit calculation. A study by Bivens and Heyman in 2016 revealed that the classification of a person registering for a site as male or female allows advertisers to continue to market based upon what they believe that user might buy. Non-binary, as a variable, on the other hand, doesn't have the arsenal of research, data, and case studies that reinforce what people in this category might purchase, or at least not yet. These sorts of examples are prevalent on the internet, but they point to a deeper logic of capitalism. This logic is fundamentally opposed to the values of queerness. It prioritizes the gaining of capital over being and searching for the truest version of oneself. My work specifically addresses the manifestation of gender and heteronormativity in the human-computer relationship. While interface demonstrates our cultural norms through metaphor so well, it's also the primary set of interaction between humans and computers. I argue that the human-computer relationship that Americans view as normal is analogous to heteronormativity. Though heteronormativity is less rigid than it once was, it still features a set of relatively strict ideals that as a society we apply to our relationships, like the presence of hierarchical power dynamics, patriarchal values, or utility. Our human-computer relationships also feature a set of strict guidelines. The human user gives a command, and the computer is expected to dutifully respond. The relationship that we form with our computers is born out of utility. We need them to perform for us as efficiently and effectively as possible. Ultimately, humans are in the dominant position, and we expect our computers to be submissive. Heteronormativity reinforces that within a relationship, there are strict roles that one must occupy. By querying these roles, I'm interested in creating human-computer relationships that allow both the human and the computer to transcend, switch, experiment, play, and do away with these roles. The relationships that I'm interested in cultivating instead are born out of unconditional love, subvert a hierarchical power dynamic, and are non-transactional and work to establish mutual caretaking. In order to achieve this, I've built 4 Google Chrome extensions that attempt to manipulate interfaces across the web in order to cultivate these qualities in a human-computer relationship. My first prototype was prompted by the question, how might close buttons express connection? On a human scale, the act of saying goodbye or seeking closure carries a lot of weight. Closing in digital space can feel capricious and inconsequential. Often it's reversible. But are there implications for how this feature might translate over to our physical lives? The extension works like this. When a browser window is closed, the browser delivers its human counterpart a message containing their last memory in URL form, a brief thank you for the birth and death of this particular window, and signs off with a numerical identifier. How might creating a mindfulness surrounding the relationships we so easily create and terminate with our browser windows instead cultivate care and intention around their summoning? The second prototype addresses the question, how might icons express a bedtime ritual? Digital caretaking for our computers is often in service of performance rather than growth or happiness. Human to living entity caretaking does not translate over to the digital world, in part because of the lack of infrastructure encouraging it. This work allows a computer's human counterpart at the end of their browsing session to methodically take icons representing sites they browsed that day and put them in their virtual bed. When all icons have been put to bed, the screen turns black and the browser closes. How might our relationship to our computers change if we were in charge of gently waking it up every morning or putting it to sleep? The third addresses the question, how might hyperlinks express shyness? This work centers on the caretaking of hyperlinks who behave as if they hold the human trait of shyness. The human interacting must move their cursor incredibly slowly to interact with hyperlinks they come across while browsing. Otherwise, fast cursor movements cause hyperlinks to temporarily shed their click-through ability and shrink down to an incredibly small size. Once the cursor movement slows, the hyperlinks grow back to their original size and regain click-through abilities. The element of trust is crucial in this work. In order to ask a hyperlink to carry a human from one site to another, in this case, one must earn the trust of the hyperlink and spend the time it takes to understand their sensitivities. How might taking the time to understand these hyperlinks extend to how we view the traits of other interface elements? Might our browsing habits change to accommodate these traits? And lastly, how might touchscreens express warmth? A warm device often means that the processor is hard at work and the device is generating heat. While warmth might be generated physically by the machine, how might we, as humans, both appreciate this warmth as evidence of hard work on the part of the computer and also show warmth in return? This work permits one's browser to redirect at randomly timed intervals to a black screen. Text on the screen encourages those browsing to seek out the warm spots with their fingers, taking a moment to appreciate their computer's labor. This work begins to envision a world in which one's computer asks for physical connection during a particularly strenuous time, as one might do with a romantic partner or friend. How might the role of communication between digital and physical realms and asking for what one wants change the way we expect our computers to behave? My intention for this work is to push for a shift in our digital space that's simultaneously intimate and jarring, speaking to the queer experience. There's intimacy in understanding oneself, knowing one's community, and allowing oneself to exist outside of traditional norms. But that also wars with the oppressive nature of coming face to face with these very norms. To those who don't experience this kind of digital resistance to their identity, they may feel that interacting with this work renders their computers foreign and unnavigable. For people who might have similar experiences, our online spaces may have felt this way for a really long time. My hope is that these extensions dislodge the stilted, rote nature of our interface and provide an element of agency to reimagine the constraining nature of these interfaces. Just as queer theory might illuminate queerness in a very binary and heteronormative world, my hope is that applying the same framework to the digital spaces that are similarly binaried can help release us from the grip of these rigid digital structures. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Elena. So now we're going to kick off the last Q&A session of the evening. So the students who will be participating are John, Cassandra, Lon, Shirley, and June. So Mimi Onuoha is here joining us tonight, and she'll be kicking off the Q&A. Mimi is a Nigerian-American artist and researcher whose work highlights the social relationships and power dynamics behind data collection. Her multimedia practice uses print, code, installation, and video to call attention to the ways in which those in the margins are differently abstracted, represented, and missed by socio-technical systems. Welcome, Mimi.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you everybody who presented. This is great. I just want to take a minute to acknowledge that all of y'all were working in such challenging circumstances and you produced such polished and interesting work. Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here to talk with each of you. And we don't have enough time. I would like to ask each of you about 5 different questions. Unfortunately, I can't. So I'm going to try to jump in, but just know that I'm asking you one question and there's like so many more after that if we had more time would go into. So start with Cassandra, because Cassandra went first. Cassandra, are you there?
Hi, I'm here.
Hey, thank you so much. I just, of course, like the project that you did has a real soft spot to me because I love zines, organized my own zine fairs, And I think there's so much important work that they do. I also just loved how you took issue with the systems of cataloging and taxonomies themselves. Really, really important thing that you did. I appreciate that. And I think Jenna's doing great work. So just everything about this, I was really excited to see. And I think you did such a great job. My question for you is this. So as you know, zines are often, they're DIY. They usually are spread by hand, word of mouth. There's this informality to them that is really built into them. And it's so important. And I know that for communities that I'm a part of, often that informality has led to a sort of closeness that can form as a kind of protection. That protection is often, it's necessary because of the particular groups that the zines are usually, they're aiding. They're really meant to be against these kind of dominant narratives. And I wonder how you reconcile this. You've made this gorgeous visualization. It's doing so much important work. And yet it also is doing this work of making something a little bit more open and opening it out to flattening the audience of who gets to engage with it. So how do you think about that? Or how have you thought about that in making this project?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. That obviously is something that comes up a lot in this kind of work. And you always have the sort of like early on sort of almost identity crisis of like, oh my God, should I even make this thing? Like, is it even ethical for me to be making this? Is this even the right direction to go for material like this, right? And the way that I sort of think about this in particular is when something is already in a catalog and it is already in an institutional collection at an institution like Barnard that is sort of a subsidiary of Columbia University. To me, that material, I don't want to say it's already lost, but in a way it's already been made visible to people who are not internal to that community, to an extent where I almost feel like there's not too much more damage that can be done in that way, if that makes sense. And so it becomes, and Jenna has said this word in conversations with me as well, it becomes almost a question of damage control of how you take this material that is present in this place and do what you can with what is there, because it is there now. It's not going to go away. Once an institution absorbs a collection like this, it's there to stay. But a question of really how do you work with what you have been given in that collection being there? But yeah, it's a huge question. And I think also the approach has to vary from instance to instance and collection to collection, where there are absolutely some zine collections that need to maintain their fugitivity in a way. And that's also why it's important for a project like this to work with something that's already been kind of cataloged and already exists in that domain.
I have a follow-up question. I'm not allowed to ask it because it's one question per person, but if I could, it would be something around specifically space and how you would think about whether creating kind of rules for what should or shouldn't be visible within a collection like this, but we can't do that. So thank you so much. Thank you for your project. Really appreciated it.
Thank you.
Gonna move on to John. Hey, John.
Hey, how you doing, Mimi?
Really good. So I love a deep dive into some kind of data set, and you delivered on that. Thank you so much. Thank you also for surfacing these issues around data and its accessibility, ownership control. I think a lot of these are issues that get really lost often when we talk about these things. So I want to thank you so much for doing that and doing it so beautifully in your project in a way that opens it up to so many people. Thank you for that. What I want to ask you about is when you described this project, when I was reading about it beforehand, hearing you speak about it and reading what's written on the DT website, you use this term, you talked about personal archives, or rather making meaningful personal archives through using this project as a way to create more meaningful personal archives. And you talked also about this idea that if you can make a data set like this truly personal, then it will make it easier to think about the topic as well. And so I wonder so much, like the data set that you're working with, it's a data set about you. It is a personal data set, but I kind of want to push and argue that also it's a collective data set, that you're not the only one who's contained in it, that actually it contains your interactions with loads of different systems, loads of different people, but it is presented to you as individualized, as is your entire sort of way, like all of our ways of accessing the web. And I wonder, do you think focusing on the collective aspect of that, would that be a way that could also make it easier for people to think about these kind of cold, seemingly inaccessible topics? Or are you staking your ground on approaching this from a more personal perspective?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so it's interesting. This project has like vacillated between being a project that is like purely about me to like something that is for other people to engage with, and I feel like it's like slowly working its way out. And if I'm being like totally honest, like I didn't really have people truly using these tools until like this week. So like I had people testing really early on with prototypes, and that was an interesting experience. But now that I'm at this point where this thing is out in the world, people are starting to share what they're uncovering from these data sets. I see that area as like a really ripe space for continuing this project, because it's, like you said, it's not just about like the queries that I'm putting in. It is how is this, like what can be exposed when you combine a bunch of these data sets, and all the interactions there. But yeah, I think it's, I've seen more work done with Google search as kind of a collective data set than I have with it as this like super personalized approach. And maybe I'm giving a wishy-washy answer on like, am I staking my ground? I'm glad that I started off with this as a purely individual approach to Google search data, but like I am super excited to expand this out and see how things could combine in all a bunch of different ways.
I feel the same way. I'm interested to see what happens and how you think about it as more and more people start to use it, and as they get back to you with what they discover or what they think of what it brings up. And I think that is really, it's very powerful. You're at this end of one part of the project, and I think there's so much more for you to uncover. So I hope that you keep on thinking about it. And also, as I said, you did it so beautifully, presented it really nicely. Thank you.
Thanks, Mimi.
Okay, Lon, I'm gonna move on to Hat Comedy.
Yay. Hi, Mimi.
Hi. That was great. I'm so glad that you brought your collaborators or friends, whoever they were. Loved it. Also love the pun in the name, really good. And actually, let me come back to that in a second. I thought this was great. I secretly love comedy, and not so secretly if I'm telling, everybody, but I really like comedy. And something I find really interesting about comedy is that as an art form, it has this really wonderful aspect, much like many other art forms, in that the content that you say is significant, but the way that you say that is just as significant. And what's interesting about your project is that you're focusing on the text of that. And so in a way, by focusing on the text, you treat that text as the sole artifact. And what we don't get is all of everything else that goes into comedy, which makes it. And as someone who knows this as a lover of comedy, as a still potential stand-up comedian, you never know, did you notice this, or how did you hold or grapple with that tension in your project?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think at the very beginning of like my whole research, I didn't really limit myself to only analyze the text. There's a lot of images that I looked into, even video clips. But I think there's something about text. I guess it's very similar to image in a way that once you take a very specific part of content out of its original context, like sometimes you can really reveal the bare bone of the themes and identities of whatever that exemplifies. And I feel like with videos and visuals, which are the stuff that we are exposed to at all time, with a lot of like the more advanced like machine learning methods, which was some of the methods that I was exploring originally, visual, pictures, videos, all of these technologies are maybe advanced is like the way to kind of put it. It's so widely used by everyone. Meanwhile, like I feel like with text, it's just kind of on its like way to becoming more and more analyzed and become more popular. So that's something that was really, really intriguing to me. And I feel like also coming from this perspective of looking at comedy also as a like a cultural, like a linguistic medium for me to explore. I think it places a very different meaning for me compared to a visual content. Yeah, I think that's kind of my way to put it.
Great. Yeah, I thought some of what you're saying now is why I thought it was such a good decision of you to do the performance around it, because it felt to me like you were sort of stripping away some of that. As you said, you talked about getting to the bare bones. You sort of stripped it away, but then you brought it back in a totally different way that really remade it and made it your own. And I very much appreciated that. I like that you didn't stop at just the machine learning text generation. You added this other layer onto it, which I thought was a really smart move for this project. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We have to move on. It's too short. I think Shirley was next.
Hi.
Hey, Shirley, how are you doing?
Very well. How are you?
Good. I have kind of two questions for you that I'm going to put into one, partly because I wanted to just get more information from you on the visual that you chose for this like immersive kind of 3D video that you made, and why you talked a little bit about it, but I wondered if you would go a little bit deeper into that. And then the second thing, maybe you can choose. I don't know what the timing is like. You had this line where you talked about how you were attempting to control your own future using technology. And I found that really interesting because you use GPT-2. And of course, that computer prediction is based on the past. And of course, it privileges everything that happened in the past. It privileges trends in the past. And it doesn't privilege any kind of changes to the future. And I found that interesting because you're talking about this alternative reality. So I wanted to know about your choice for that technology as a way to get you into thinking about something different, into an alternative. And then as well, this just in general, more about that, the imagery that you actually chose.
Yeah, of course. I think perhaps I'm probably going to start with the second question. So I started out this project kind of trying to understand decision-making in the past and how I've made decisions, and came to this realization that all the decisions that I've ever made around me has been influenced by the context and the society that I live in, the decisions that my family has made about my life in the past, and it goes back multiple generations. And I kind of saw this relationship between that and how GPT-2 was created. And I had not mentioned this in my presentation, but I had actually wrote this in my thesis paper about how perhaps I can't control my alternative reality. And this is just kind of the context that we live in. And in order to accept that, it's kind of how I move forward in this space and in this idea of the multiverse. And to answer your first question about the visuals that I chose, I really wanted my visuals to feel realistic because I wanted it to look like I am actually in the multiverse. I'm in this other universe. And I'm not really in this Unity or virtual space. So I had recorded certain scenes in certain areas that are personal to my own narrative, the narrative that came out of the interview, in addition, kind of metaphorically reflect some of the narratives that were generated by the computer algorithms. So I only showed one clip, and the flowers and kind of like the outdoor scene was kind of how I represented happiness. And there was this beautiful line that GPT-2 generated. This idea of happiness has always been a Western idea of happiness, and I wanted to kind of highlight this feeling and this emotion. And the other scenes kind of reflect the narratives itself. And you can view it on my website, also on parsons.edu/DT.
Great. The follow-up question that I can't ask has to do with the two other people who you worked with around making this, and this question of audience, and the Asian American thing you were talking about. What was it exact? Oh, I didn't write down the exact phrase you used, but I found it really interesting. And I want to talk about how they perceive this, but we didn't. Next time.
We're actually watching this right now. So right now, I don't know if they're on Zoom, but I would love for them to kind of drop in and answer the question. But I had chosen these individuals because they're both Asian American women, either first or second generation, and we're actually friends, and we've lived very similar lives, but have chosen very different paths to go down. So I kind of wanted to analyze this idea of Asian American culture being perceived as monolithic in America, but in addition to that, kind of analyze how the choices that we've made have led us down different paths.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, tell them if they're here, they should drop a little line in the chat. Thank you, Shirley.
Thank you.
And I think last is June.
Hi.
Hey, June. I think after all of this, I'm going to be cut off. So I'm just going to quickly say that I found some really nice, I felt like a lot of y'all's projects were in conversation with each other. And in some ways, I wish that we could, again, I wish we had more time, but I wish we were all in a room so that you could like go back and forth on one another's. But June, I have the question. So wonderful. So really evocative. I love this world that you created for us. I love all the thought and the depth that went into it. I have a series of questions for you. I'll only ask one or two. The first one, in the same way I did with Shirley, there's sort of a heavier one and a lighter one. The lighter one has to do with the format. You choosing specifically an audiovisual essay for this kind of topic, I find to be a really interesting, intentional decision that puts us and orients us in a certain kind of way. And so I'm interested to know why you chose that format as opposed to any of the other ones that you could have used. But then the kind of heavier question is that you're doing this wonderful sort of speculative work, this, I don't know if you identified as that, but you're kind of asserting, you put forth these provocations about a different kind of future, a different kind of existence. And I wonder, you were talking about this productive labor versus reproductive labor. And what you said made me think about Nandita Sharma, who's a wonderful kind of thinker. And she has talked about how we get this when we find ourselves often, particularly in more like radical spaces, find ourselves ending up on one or the other of a side like this. We get caught in these dualisms. And so I wonder if what you think about the idea that to focus on work could be to still exist within the logics of the very capitalist exploitative system that you're critiquing, that to use that as your center point. Is that, not saying if I think this or not really, but just what do you think about that? Which is really a question about what does it look like to try to imagine something different when you can only use the language of the time that you're in right now?
To answer your first question, I started this project when I first started at Parsons, and the early iterations were all audiovisual narratives, and that format worked with me, and it was something that I was comfortable with. And coming into Thesis, I experimented with different forms, but I kind of gave up after a while after receiving feedback, because a lot of people were like, oh, you created these like earlier iterations that worked really well. So I kind of went back to this format, and it was actually really enjoyable for me. My background's in architecture, so kind of like imagining this world and like the space and the environment that it engenders was just a very enjoyable part of the process. And I've also been informed by other artists who produce audiovisual narratives, people like Hiro Steirl, and I actually saw her retrospective at the AGO in Toronto in the winter. And after that, it was kind of just like, this is like what I'm gonna do. To answer your second question, could you just clarify what you mean by like the latter half of the second question?
Yeah, I wonder, it's kind of this age-old sort of question, but whether it's the larger version of it is sort of the short thing I said at the end, which is the tension of trying to imagine different realities, different worlds, when you can only use the language that emerges from the logics of the world that you exist in. And whether there's a way out of that, whether you see this as being out of that, or whether you see it as being to some degree tethered to that. and particularly I'm saying in focusing on labor and focusing on work, whether you're talking about a world in which you're like, oh, labor, there's no productive labor, there's just reproductive labor. Does it need to be called labor in that sense?
Right.
What does that give it? What does that take away?
I guess like with my project, as I said earlier, it sits kind of in the gray area between something that's reflects reality and unreality. And I decided to basically situate all of this research that I did earlier in the context of a post-work society. Because one of the earliest questions that I actually asked myself during this process was, what is the future of reproductive labor in an increasingly automated society that questions the meaning of work itself? And while I did not get that far to kind of like redefine what work actually means, to me, like, you know, I wasn't writing like a PhD dissertation. I was trying to make an MFA thesis, and I guess it's like the time constraints, but also I want to kind of focus on how to make this work visible in the context of things that are currently happening, but also kind of situating it in like a distant future.
Yeah, to be clear, I think it worked. I think you did a really but I'm interested in your thinking going into it. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
Did that answer your question? Sorry.
Of course.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. Okay. I think that's all. Right, Allison?
Yeah.
We've gone way over.
We're good. No. It's
thanks so much. Thanks, y'all. That was really, really, really wonderful. And your projects, as I said, are so polished. And I just so appreciated seeing them. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mimi, for just these amazing, critical, and insightful questions that you're able to ask everyone. I'm sure it was more than appreciated from all the speakers tonight. But yeah, I guess that really kind of wraps up our second evening of the live stream. So again, thank you to our guest respondents, Mimi, and from earlier, Dr. Yoldas. Because of some activity in the chat, we've got some requests to keep the Zoom link open for a little after party, but we will stop the recording and stop the streaming. So for anybody who wants to stick on here and congratulate your people. But yeah, just a heads up, we still have one more night of the live stream that's happening again tomorrow at the same time, 6 p.m. And that track is titled Immersive Narratives. And then for all the DT folks on here, we got John Sharp and Jess Irish, who are just going to make some closing remarks since this will be the last event of our online semester. So thank you, everyone, and especially a huge thanks to Shirley, Karen, Yash, and Akshansh, who've been working super hard in the background tonight. So thanks, guys. All right, see you all tomorrow.
Yay! Wait, so are we staying on this? Are we staying on this link?